The portraits look elegant at first glance. Perfect posture, soft candlelight, faces frozen in calm authority. But the longer you look, the more something feels off. Not one person has natural hair. Not one face looks alive. It's as if an entire generation agreed to disguise itself at the same time. And that's where the lie begins. We're taught that powdered wigs were just fashion, that aristocrats shaved their heads for hygiene, that lice forced an entire elite class to wear towers of hair soaked in grease and chalk. But think about that for more than 5 seconds. These were people who engineered palaces, financed global trade, and funded scientific revolutions. Are we really supposed to believe their best solution to hygiene was strapping rotting hair onto their skulls? A wig wasn't clean, it was the opposite. Thick, warm, impossible to wash properly. If lice were the problem, short hair or shaved heads would have solved it instantly. Vinegar, alcohol, and herbal antiseptics were common. The official explanation collapses the moment logic enters the room. So why did wigs become mandatory? Why did baldness suddenly need to be hidden at all costs? Because hair wasn't being removed, it was disappearing. Across Europe, across Russia, across the American colonies, members of the ruling class began losing their hair rapidly and irreversibly. Not patches, not thinning, total loss, scalp, beard, eyebrows. This wasn't a trend. It was a symptom, and in that world, being visibly sick meant being weak. Weakness was dangerous. So they covered it. The wig wasn't fashion, it was a prosthetic. Look closer at the faces in those paintings. The skin is ghost white, unnaturally smooth, almost swollen. That wasn't beauty, that was damage being buried under layers of lead-based makeup. White lead, mercury compounds, arsenic. These weren't rare substances, they were standard cosmetics. People knew they were toxic. They used them anyway. Why would an entire elite knowingly poison themselves? Because the alternative was worse. Ulcers that wouldn't heal, strange pigmentation, sores that looked like burns, skin conditions that couldn't be exposed to daylight. These weren't vanity problems. These were signs of systemic biological collapse. The makeup wasn't decoration, it was camouflage. Then there were the teeth. By their 30s, many nobles had no teeth left. Not cavities, not decay from sugar, entire jaws deteriorating, bone dissolving, dentures made from ivory, animal teeth, even other humans' teeth. Historians blame sugar. But sugar wasn't common enough to destroy an entire class simultaneously. What does do that is heavy metal exposure, or radiation. Bone doesn't lie. The fans they carried weren't just for flirting, they masked the smell. Rotting gums produce a scent no perfume can hide. The smiles you see in portraits are closed for a reason. Now look at the clothes. High collars choking the neck, thick scarves indoors, gloves never removed, skin covered even in summer. This wasn't modesty, it was concealment. The thyroid is one of the first organs to react to environmental poisoning. Goiters, surgical scars, deformities. Tailors adapted because bodies were changing. Medicine followed the same pattern. Mercury treatments, bloodletting. We're told doctors were ignorant. That's comforting, but it's not true. They understood mercury was dangerous. They used it anyway, because sometimes one poison is used to push out another. Bloodletting wasn't superstition. It was crude detox. Drain the contaminated fluid and hope the body survives long enough to replace it. These weren't rituals. They were emergency measures. Which raises the question no textbook wants to ask. What happened to the environment? Diseases don't appear simultaneously across continents without a shared cause. Hair loss, skin damage, organ failure, bone necrosis. These are systemic failures triggered by something external, something global. Now look at the architecture. Palaces with ceilings 20 feet high, walls of stone, single-pane windows the size of modern billboards. Built, we're told, during the coldest period in recent history, the so-called Little Ice Age. Rivers freezing solid, crops failing, people dying from cold. And yet the elite supposedly lived in buildings that were impossible to heat. Fireplaces too small to warm a fraction of the space, halls designed for airflow, not insulation. These weren't winter palaces. They were climate structures built for a different world, a warmer one, or one with technology we no longer recognize. Which suggests something else entirely. What if these people didn't build these cities? What if they found them? Old paintings show ruins in the middle of thriving capitals, massive stone structures overgrown with trees. Artists are dismissed as romantic fantasists. But what if they were documenting reality? What if the wig-wearing aristocracy were squatters in the remains of a destroyed civilization? That would explain everything. The scale, the mismatch, the desperation, the sickness. And then there's the ground beneath your feet. Walk through any old city. Look at the windows half buried underground, doors that lead nowhere, entire floors swallowed by earth. We're told it's a cultural layer, centuries of dirt piling up because people were lazy. That explanation is an insult to intelligence. Dirt doesn't rise evenly. Cities don't bury themselves, but floods do, mudslides do, planetary-scale events do. And if that buried layer was saturated with toxic material, radioactive or chemical, then living above it would slowly poison everything: air, water, soil, people. Those closest to power lived closest to the epicenter. They moved upstairs, servants stayed below. Not hierarchy, survival. The wigs, the powder, the collars, the gloves, the mercury, the bloodletting, all of it wasn't decadence, it was adaptation. A species trying to survive in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. And if this is true, then the Age of Enlightenment wasn't the rise of reason, it was the aftermath of collapse. In the next part, we'll follow what happened after the cities were buried, where the missing population came from, why orphan factories appeared overnight, and how history itself may have been rewritten by people who were never meant to rule, only to manage the ruins. If this perspective unsettled you, good. That means you're looking past the powder. Stay with me, because once you see what comes next, you can't unsee it. If the cities were buried and the old world shattered, the next question becomes unavoidable. Where did the people go? Not the buildings, not the forts, the people. A civilization capable of carving granite with surgical precision doesn't simply vanish without leaving bodies, records, or continuity. And yet, when we move from the 18th into the 19th century, something impossible happens. The population doesn't recover slowly, it explodes. Demographic charts don't rise, they launch straight up. We're told this was because of better medicine and agriculture, but we've already seen the truth. Medicine was mercury and bloodletting. Cities were drowning in sewage. Cholera and typhus swept through entire regions. There were no antibiotics, no anesthesia, no sanitation systems as we understand them today. Under those conditions, populations don't double, they collapse. Women cannot biologically sustain that level of reproduction in poisoned environments. Infants don't survive in mass numbers in cities where drinking water itself is lethal. The math does not work. Biology refuses the official story. So something else must have happened. And that something appears quietly, almost innocently, in historical records under a comforting name: foundling homes. We're told these were charities, shelters for unwanted children, acts of mercy. But look at them, really look. These weren't small orphanages, they were vast complexes, palaces in their own right, hundreds of meters long, entire wings, internal infrastructure that resembled factories more than homes. Why would a society supposedly drowning in poverty pour unimaginable resources into raising abandoned children? And where did the children come from? Archives mention infants arriving by convoys, thousands at a time. No names, no parents, no documents, just numbers. Babies processed like inventory. Many died, that's admitted, but many survived, enough to flood the workforce within a generation. This wasn't adoption, it was redistribution, or worse. There is no plausible social explanation for millions of abandoned infants appearing simultaneously across Europe and Russia in deeply religious societies where illegitimacy was a severe stigma. Poverty does not override maternal instinct at that scale. Fear does not either, but necessity does. If a civilization needed workers immediately, not families, not citizens, but hands, then the ideal worker would be one without history, without parents, without memory. Someone who would never ask what came before. A blank slate. And that's exactly what these children were. They grew up institutionalized. Uniform education, minimal language, no ancestral stories, no cultural continuity. They were trained to obey, to labor, to fill the emptied cities. By the time they reached adulthood, the old world was already a myth to them. And into that vacuum, a new history could be inserted. This explains something else historians struggle to justify: the sudden appearance of noble families with no lineage, surnames that emerge out of nowhere, titles granted not through bloodlines but paperwork, loyalty rewarded with status. A new hierarchy was being assembled, artificially. At the top sat the sick elite, the wig wearers, the survivors who still had access to the ruins, the artifacts, the sealed knowledge. Beneath them, an ocean of people who knew nothing except the version of reality they were taught. This wasn't evolution, it was management. And it required one more thing: control of energy. Because whoever controls energy controls society. Look at old cathedrals, starforts, domes, spires, metal frameworks embedded into stone. These structures don't behave like mere decoration. Their geometry is precise, repeating, global. Identical principles appear on different continents long before global communication existed. We're told they were religious, defensive, symbolic. But symbols don't require mathematical perfection. What if these structures weren't symbolic at all? What if they were functional? There is a concept erased from modern science, but present everywhere in older texts: ether, a medium filling all space, a source of energy accessible everywhere, not extracted, not burned, collected. If such a system existed, it would explain why ancient buildings prioritized height, metal, symmetry, and exposure, why domes were gilded, why towers dominated skylines, why cities looked like circuitry when viewed from above. And after the catastrophe, this system became dangerous or uncontrollable. So it was dismantled. Resonators removed, metal connections severed, structures rebranded as churches, palaces, monuments. Their function forgotten or deliberately erased. And in their place came a new energy economy: coal, oil, gas. Resources that must be extracted, metered, sold. Resources that create dependency. The people in wigs didn't invent this system. They inherited the responsibility of enforcing it. Middle managers of a broken world, allowed to live in the ruins as long as they followed orders and kept silent. Their sickness was the price. Which brings us back to the wigs. They weren't hiding vanity. They were hiding mutation, exposure, genetic damage, the marks of proximity to something far more powerful than they could control. And while they managed the ruins, while they rewrote the story, while they trained a new humanity to forget, the truth didn't disappear. It sank, literally, under streets, under floors, under layers of mud and brick. And in the final part, we'll confront the most disturbing implication of all. If history was reset once, if humanity was repopulated artificially, then the question isn't what happened back then. The question is whether it's happening again. If you're still listening, you're already asking the right questions. Stay with me. The final layer is the hardest to face. If the past was erased once, then history isn't a timeline, it's a loop. That realization is the most uncomfortable of all, because it doesn't just reframe the 18th century, it pulls the present into the same pattern. And once you see the pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. Let's return to the ground beneath us, because the most reliable evidence of a global reset is not hidden in books, it's buried in plain sight. Across the world, the oldest cities share the same anomaly. Streets that sit several meters higher than the buildings beside them. Windows that begin below ground level. Doors that open into walls of earth. Entire floors swallowed and renamed basements. We're told this happened slowly, that dirt accumulated over centuries because people were careless. But this explanation collapses under its own weight. Soil does not rise evenly across entire cities. Waste does not bury stone facades with surgical consistency. And no functioning society allows its streets to climb above its own entrances. What does create uniform burial is a sudden, massive deposition of material. Mud, silt, clay, water-saturated debris. A flood. Not a biblical metaphor, a physical event, planetary in scale. And if that material carried toxic elements, heavy metals, or radioactive isotopes, then the consequences would linger for generations. Moist soil releases vapor. It contaminates groundwater. It alters the air itself. People living above it wouldn't die instantly. They would decay slowly. Hair would be the first casualty. Hair follicles are extremely sensitive to endocrine disruption. When the body is overwhelmed, it sacrifices what it can to preserve vital organs. Baldness becomes a survival response, a warning signal, a biological alarm. The aristocracy lost their hair not because of fashion, but because they were closest to the source. Living in cities, occupying massive stone structures built long before, surrounded by buried layers still emitting danger. This also explains why they moved upward, the so-called noble floor, the second or third level. Servants below, kitchens below, storage below. Not classism, radiation gradient. But even that wasn't enough. Their bodies continued to fail. Teeth dissolved, skin broke down, organs weakened, and still they stayed. Because leaving meant losing power, and power was the only thing keeping their fragile bodies alive. Now compare this biological collapse with the technological feats attributed to the same people. Star forts, perfect geometric monsters carved into the earth across every continent. Identical designs, kilometer-scale precision. Stone blocks weighing tens of tons, fitted so tightly a blade can't pass between them. We're told these were built by sick, balding men using shovels, horses, and wheelbarrows. That's not history, that's fantasy. The labor alone exceeds what entire armies could physically sustain. The mathematics required predates modern surveying tools. The stonework contradicts the supposed technological level of the era. The only logical conclusion is that these structures were not built then. They were uncovered, excavated, cleared from the mud. The so-called Great Construction era was actually a great cleanup, a salvage operation on a planetary scale. The survivors didn't create greatness, they inherited debris and took credit. Which means the civilization before the flood was far more advanced than anything that came after. And that is the real reason history had to be rewritten. Because if humanity remembered that it once lived in a world with free energy, global infrastructure, and environmental stability, it would never accept chains disguised as progress. So the story was inverted. Ancient became primitive. Ruins became foundations. Inheritance became innovation. And humanity was told it crawled forward from caves instead of falling from the sky. The children raised in foundling homes were the final lock on this system. Millions of people whose memory began in institutions. No grandparents, no ancestral homes, no stories passed down. They became the workforce of the industrial age. They built railways, dug canals, worked factories, not because they were free, but because they didn't know another reality had ever existed. And once a population grows up without memory, you can tell it anything. You can say the buildings were always that way. You can say the streets were always that high. You can say energy has always been scarce. You can say the wigs were fashion. But memory has a strange property. It leaks. It appears as intuition, as discomfort, as the feeling that something doesn't add up, as the quiet realization that official explanations sound rehearsed, shallow, defensive. Why did stone masonry degrade instead of improve? Why do old maps show cities where deserts now exist? Why do modern buildings fail faster than structures supposedly built with primitive tools? Why does every culture carry flood myths that are dismissed but never explained? These aren't coincidences, they're fragments. And now we stand at a familiar edge. A world facing environmental instability, rapid technological shifts, social restructuring, identity fragmentation, history being rewritten in real time, memory outsourced, attention shortened. The conditions of a reset. The wigs of today look different. They're digital, social, psychological. But the function is the same: to hide damage, to normalize decay, to convince people that what they're experiencing is progress. The aristocrats of the powdered age weren't villains in the traditional sense. They were survivors, managers of collapse. They didn't design the system, they enforced it. And now the question isn't whether this happened, it's whether we recognize it happening again. Because the greatest trick in history isn't hiding the truth, it's making each generation believe it's the first to live through the end of the world. Look down at the street beneath your feet. Look at the buildings that don't make sense. Look at the narratives that require you not to think too hard. Once you notice the cracks, you can't go back. The masquerade never ended. It just changed costumes. And now that you see the strings, the only question left is this: will you keep watching the performance, or will you start asking, who built the stage?